Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is part of the Transformative Agenda webinar series. My name is Panos Foumsis, and I'm going to be the facilitator for today's webinar. Today's webinar focuses on a very important topic, a topic that is in the heart of everybody, and we often struggle with it. It's about prioritization in humanitarian operations. How do we go about doing it right? Before introducing the speakers and the topic, I'd like just to say first a few ground rules regarding the webinar. So the first point I would like to make is really for everybody, please stay on mute at all times. This is really important in order to be able to follow the conversation. Now, the webinar is going to last for about 90 minutes. During the first 45 minutes, I will be asking questions to introduce the topic to our four distinguished speakers. During the second 45 minutes, I would like to take over your questions that I would like to ask and pass on to the speakers. As you look to your screen, you will see that the screen basically has three parts, and I hope you can all see it. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have the title of the webinar, and that will change as the presentation goes. I'd like to point really to two additional features of the webinar that I hope you can all use. The first one is the chat box. If you look on the top right-hand side of your screen, and if you click at the chat, you will see that you have the opportunity to talk among yourselves, but also with the speakers at any given time of the webinar. I'd really like to encourage you to use it actively. Don't hesitate to react, to respond, to challenge, to give your reflections. And our speakers are all available and also will be providing answers and feedback and participating in the chat as we go. And of course, you can also talk in between yourselves to share best practices, react to the speakers, and so on. The other feature that is available is a Q&A box. So again, on the top right-hand side of your screen, if you click to the Q&A, a little box comes up on the lower part, which allows you to send questions to us, to send questions to me, which I will be taking and asking to the speakers in the second part, in the second 45 minutes of the webinar. We really want to make sure your questions are answered and to hear your voice and your feedback as this live interactive discussion on this topic goes on. You will also see there is already a polling that is up on your screen. We're going to have two. One at the beginning where we just like to get a sense of who is online at this point. And then there will be a polling that is going to come up at the very end of the webinar where we'll just like to have your evaluation, your feedback on how was the webinar, what you liked, what you didn't like, what other topics you would like us to prepare in future webinars. Today's topic, as I was saying, is really going to focus on prioritization. Prioritization is a topic that is really quite challenging and particularly one is down at the operations. In 2015, globally, as a humanitarian community, our needs have risen to over $20 billion, if we include the UN, the NGOs, but also ICRC. This is a significant increase than what we've had just even 5 or 10 years ago. At best, the prediction is that in terms of funding and resources, we may be able to get about 50% of this amount. This is really a dramatic situation because obviously the needs globally, the humanitarian needs, are expanding at a speed that is much greater than the ability of the funding to be able to cover it. I also have to say that the financial resources over the last few years have also increased significantly, but clearly the needs are much greater than the financial ability to be able to cover the basic needs of the people that we're trying to help. But the key question is, are we doing prioritization just because of funding? Is prioritization also a tool that can also help us in order to better target? Is it something that as a humanitarian community we should be doing anyway in order to really increase efficiency and make sure that what we do addresses the need of the people? Do we make sure that the prioritization takes into account what the affected people really would like us to do. And the key question is, when we have so many needs and the resources are limited, what do we do first? What is the most urgent? What is the most important? What is really the first activity that should come out first, and then what should come second and what should follow? How do we guide the allocation of resources? When the donors ask us, what is your priority? What is the right answer, and how to make sure that as a humanitarian family, we have together this sense of collectivity, this sense of engagement to the priorities of the operation, as opposed to the priority of our own agency, mandate, or issue that we're trying to work on. How does this solidarity comes together? To answer to all these questions, we have with us 4 distinguished speakers that I would like to introduce. We've asked all our speakers and their answers to give you practical advice, practical steps, and we really have identified 2 best cases or 2 examples from the field who will speak up about the practical steps they have taken, which we hope that it would help you all to be able to really apply prioritization in your own operation at the ground. So our first speaker is Liz Grander. Liz is the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General, Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq, managing one of the most complex operations and L3 with lots of challenges on the ground. Our second speaker is Emily Fernandez, and Emily is working with the NGO Forum Secretariat in DRC Congo. She's joining us from Kinshasa, and she would bring her perspective from the NGO perspective, being part of the humanitarian family and trying to see how to prioritize in such a vast, complex, and chronic operation like we've seen in DRC Congo. Our next speaker is Dylan Winder, who is the head of the Humanitarian Policy and Partnership at DFID. He's joining us from London. And we all very much want to hear the DFID perspective, but also the donor perspective in terms of why is it important and how really do we move forward in a way that also makes it easier for the donors to see what to fund and how to go about it. And our fourth speaker is Andrew Wiley. Andrew is the Chief of the Program Support Branch, working with OCHA in Geneva. Actually, Andrew is sitting just next to me and will be also providing from his experience the feedback and also from a policy but also practical point of view in terms of how to go about prioritization, and hopefully by the end of the webinar you will be able to have a clear understanding and a better way in order to take forward the prioritization. I also want to highlight that during the webinar, there's a number of documents that we will be downloading. Actually, it's practical steps, is case studies, is best examples that you can also take back to your desk, to your work, reread it, share it with colleagues, and take it to able to apply it. This webinar is going to be repeated at 4 p.m. Geneva time this afternoon. So if you have any colleagues who would like to join, please let them know. I also would like to let you know that the webinar is actually recorded and it will be available on website for anybody who would want to replay it and take it forward. So I'd like actually to move first to Liz, who is joining us from Iraq. Liz, I know you've just come out off a plane on an overnight flight. So I'd like to ask you, Liz, from your experience in Iraq, you have gone through a very rigorous exercise in prioritization, trying to bring basically a $2 billion plan into a $500 million or less, while the needs are increasing, while the humanitarian situation has been going on for quite some time, and you have numerous challenges on the ground. So, Liz, how does the prioritizations contribute to a more effective or a more efficient response? Over to you.
Panos, thank you very much for welcoming us, and allow me to greet our colleagues who are on the panel with me, Emily, Dylan, and Andy. It's really a pleasure to be with everyone. Panos, maybe I can start off my reflections by sharing with you a piece of advice that I received when I was a very new humanitarian coordinator. I was told by three of the humanitarian coordinators that at the time were the most famous in the system. We were all having dinner together, and I was saying, I'm about to become an HC. What advice can you give me? And all three of them said to me one thing. They said, whatever you do, if you want to survive as a humanitarian coordinator and be effective, whatever you do, don't prioritize. And, you know, I remember thinking at the time, oh, no, surely that can't be right. Surely our job as the facilitator of the operation, as the person who leads strategically discussions with
Liz, we seem to have lost you. Can you please make sure you're well connected and you're not muted? We've lost you, Liz. Liz, we seem to have lost you. We cannot hear you at all.
Panos, can you hear us now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Very good. Sorry we lost you. Please continue.
So, Panos, I was sharing the story about why some of the most respected humanitarian coordinators in the system were saying don't prioritize. And part of why they were saying that was, number one, when you prioritize, you go up against very powerful entrenched interests that are part of the broader humanitarian community. And in having any discussion about prioritization, I think we need to be honest with ourselves that this is not just a technical operation. This is not just something we do technically. In fact, any time you do prioritization, what you are really doing is implicating yourself in a very complex political exercise. The second point that was being raised was the humanitarian coordinators were saying to me, the reason you don't prioritize is because there are no clear criteria upon which you can do that. So if you embark in it, you know, unless if you are able to create those criteria amongst your humanitarian country team, and unless that country team is able to share those all the way up the humanitarian architecture to the level of executive directors, if you're not able to do that, the exercise will seem by definition arbitrary. So bearing that very good advice in mind, I have spent my entire career as a humanitarian coordinator trying what I was forced to do in Iraq, which was to prioritize. And this is the segue into your first question to us, why did we have to do it here? Panos, there were really 4 reasons why we did it, of which one was decisive. The 4 reasons were the operation was running out of money, and we were faced with the imminent shutdown or reduction in key life-saving programs. Problem number 2, we were in L3 emergency with an operation that was, in almost all respects, off rails. Problem number 3, as a humanitarian country team, we were trying to do too much, we were spread too thin, and we weren't having the kind of impact that our beneficiaries expected us to have. And then point number 4, and you alluded to this already, we were faced with absolutely huge needs. The needs were projected to grow exponentially in the foreseeable future. We knew that we were going to have to stretch our resources, and we were determined as a humanitarian country team to do the stretch in a way which was principled, which was logical and evidence-based, which was transparent, and which laid out a collectively agreed roadmap for the activities that we want sequenced. So a summary answer is we did it not because we wanted to, but because we were faced with a set of factors which just made the point for us. It was decided for us. We were out of money, the operation was in trouble, we weren't having the impact that we needed. needs were absolutely growing, and we wanted to address that in a way which was principled, logical, evidence-based, transparent, and which laid out a clear roadmap.
Liz, you're loud and clear, presenting the impossible challenge in hand, and yet to be able to produce a priority and to sit as the team. I heard you talking about the agreed criteria and the importance of bringing everybody on board in a transparent and open way, and we will hear more about that in a minute, and also listening to your 4 points on why you did it. And although not every operation is an L3, the issues you've described are actually very relevant to many of our listeners. I want to say a particular welcome to the listeners, because I've seen now the number is really shot up. We have over 100 colleagues that are listening to us live. I want to say a particular welcome to colleagues in Asia. I can see listeners from Afghanistan, Nepal, the Philippines, but also a lot in the Middle East, Iraq, and of course quite a lot of Africa. Actually, we have listeners from 19 countries in Africa, so this is really a topic that is of huge interest to many colleagues. I'd like actually to move to the next speaker, and Dylan, I'd like to come to you and ask you, we have, in preparation for this webinar, we received in advance a question that came from the field, and the question was really the colleagues in the question saying, donors are really always pushing us for a better prioritization. That's kind of almost a standard question that comes all the time where they talk to us. Or is the prioritization from your perspective useful because you really want to be able just to decide how to allocate the money, or is it because you really also want to see kind of the efficiency, the credibility of the response itself? And I think that Liz talked about it. What's from a DFID, but also from a broader donor perspective, what do you want to see and why do you want to see a prioritization? Dylan, over to you.
Thanks, Panos, and also thanks very much for inviting me to be on the panel with a very distinguished cast list, so that's great. And I think this subject is one which is absolutely critical for us. I mean, maybe just to, I think in terms of your question, I think it's a bit of both. It's a bit about better prioritization, and it's also a bit about the kind of credibility of the response plans. But I want to step back a bit. Standing in DFID headquarters, we're now a 0.7 donor. Our funding to humanitarian has gone up from about 7% to 12% of our overall budget. But for us, it's now about choice. We no longer have a rising budget. What we are able to spend, we have to prioritize across the world. So we've had an interesting discussion quite recently about L3s and what they really mean, and that actually they're about surge, but donors quite often have been using them to say, okay, these are the top priorities, and that's where we should be putting our funding. So I think there's a kind of broader issue about how we prioritize across the globe in terms of where we put our limited funding. I think we do need to attract new donors on board and also look for different ways of financing, and it's great that the Humanitarian Summit and the high-level panel on financing is looking at some of these issues. In terms of the kind of actual appeals process, I think, within DFID, if I talked to my top management, say a couple of years ago, they'd have said, actually, appeals are quite bloated, there's a lot of competition for resources between agencies, they're not very needs-based, they're very kind of demand-led. Let's just look at 50% of the appeals as being the right level of kind of funding. I think that's changed, and that's great, and I think the SRP has really helped with that process. And I think actually, the example from Iraq and Liz's efforts to really prioritise there have been fantastic, and I think that gives an enormous amount of credibility to appeals globally, and I hope we can see more of that. I do think that there's an issue at the moment between a sort of proliferation of appeals. We need to make sure that there is one appeal that is based on impartiality and need, and we must target those most vulnerable. And we believe as DFID that the humanitarian community, the humanitarian country team, is best placed to determine what those priorities are. So I think, for us, it's about respecting what the country teams are doing, ensuring that those appeals we are seeing that are evidence-based, as has come up alongside me. But also, I think it's looking at other options. So, for example, can we invest up front in resilience and preparedness? We know that offers better value for money in responses in areas which are more prone to natural disasters. in protracted crises, we think that humanitarian funding, and DFID is quite lucky because we don't have a split between our humanitarian development budgets, unlike others. We think that we should be using humanitarian funding for absolutely essential humanitarian needs, but looking at funding things that are more long-term through the development budget. So I think there is a better, we need a better mix of instruments in some of these long-term protracted crises to free up some of those sort of resources. So I think those are kind of the key things really, but I do, as I say, I think the main thing for us is really prioritisation. Yes, it's essential. We're looking at this from a global level, but the examples of Lee's and others who've really looked at the priorities, tried to reduce the competition between agencies, looked at really how do we support the most vulnerable in terms of rising needs globally, is really essential, and that builds the credibility of appeals to donors. And I think hopefully you'll get more from donors to those real key priorities.
Dylan, thanks a lot. I hear really your key message, which is to colleagues in the field, do the prioritization at the field level. We trust you. It has to come from a bottom up, and it's much better and done if it's done there rather than receiving a bigger appeal and you having to decide what is the best priority. So really the priority and the voice to come up from the field. I'm actually going to move to our next speaker here in Geneva, and to Andy, and I will come right after to Emily in Kinshasa. Andy, you are really in charge at OCHA at the team, which basically provides the coordination on putting together the strategic or the humanitarian response plan, this document that everybody looks at, aspires to, follows, implements, and guides the operation at the ground. So what would you say are the different ways or the best practices that you have seen across the globe on prioritization for humanitarian response? How can the field go about implementing it at the field level? Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Panos, and greetings to everyone online, and including the panelists and colleagues in the field. Before I talk about prioritization, I wanted to make a quick distinction between what we call, when it comes to strategic planning, boundary setting, the distinction between that and prioritization. When our teams in the field are developing their collective response plans, they're reviewing the analysis of needs and determining which of those needs must be met by the collective that's in place and able to respond to those needs. And they do that by setting a number of boundaries, which could be focused on levels of severity of need, on geographical boundaries, on potentially thresholds for humanitarian intervention. And it's those boundaries that then allow them to determine what are the different interventions that will need to be included in the plan in order to achieve the strategic objectives that they have set out. So when a plan is complete, and I've heard Stephen O'Brien use this phrase, that plan represents 100% of the minimum that we need to do to meet the needs that we have identified or determined require a response from the international collective. So that's a key point to make and to understand that we're not asking for more than we need. We're asking for what is needed to meet those needs and achieve objectives. And it's key that plan, those boundaries we've set, are credible. Without that plan, you'll have difficulty going into a prioritization exercise, which is about taking it a step further and saying, what of the activities that we have prioritized need to be done first? What activities perhaps are so time critical because they're targeting at the they're the most life-saving activities, or they're targeting the people who are currently at that moment most vulnerable, or they're enabling activities that will allow those critical life-saving activities to go forward. Or perhaps there's an interdependence on health activity and a nutrition activity. So that's what prioritization really is. It's looking at what needs to happen first in order to help the decision makers in a humanitarian operation ensure the most effective implementation and coordination of that operation. In many cases, what we're seeing is that humanitarian country teams are using different kinds of criteria, some general prioritization criteria, as well as some context-specific prioritization criteria. The key thing is that the definition of those criteria happens during the planning exercise and follows the boundary setting that I talked about a few moments ago. The risk is if we don't prioritize, if we don't determine what needs to happen when, others are going to prioritize for us. And we know very well that that some of the CERF allocations will be prioritized. We know donors, donors will apply prioritization criteria. So it's really important for us to, as part of the planning exercise, set those prioritization criteria and apply them to the activities that we have included in our plan. Back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Andy. Very helpful to spell out these two steps. Step one, the boundary definition, and we also heard Liz talking basically about the agreed criteria, getting everybody to agree what the boundary is and what is it that we will put. And then the second one is on what do we do first, the whole prioritization. It was very helpful to walk us through the two steps. I would like us now to all go to Kinshasa and listen to Emily. Emily has been working in DRC since 2007. She has been there for the last 8 years and has worked in various capacities. She's now with the Danish Refugee Council, and among other things, she was also part of the Pool Fund Board. Dylan, you talked a minute ago about the need basically for the field to take the decisions. And Emily, I would like to ask you, in DRC, you basically have a pool fund, and it's actually a good model, I think, where the decisions and the empowerment is given to the HC and the HCT and the humanitarian community to decide on the spot what is it, the most, what are the boundaries, what is what we want to do first, and to implement it at the field level with a kind of a trust of the donor community funding through a pool fund mechanism. So, Emily, can you tell us how do you prioritize within the pool fund in DRC in a country that is so huge, so vast, it's chronic, it's really an enormous operation. So, how do you do it? Who is involved? Do you feel that the prioritization actually makes the response more effective on the ground? Emily, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Panos, for inviting me to this webinar, and hello to every participant and panelists. So, yes, of course, DRC is a big country with huge needs and a protracted crisis. That's why it's important for us to prioritize, of course, about limitation of funds, but because we have too many needs. And for us, for the pool fund, we prioritize based on the prioritization of the humanitarian needs of a view. That means for us in DRC, we have prioritization in 4 crises: the crisis of violence and armed groups, the crisis of malnutrition, the crisis of epidemics, and the possible crisis of natural disaster. And for each crisis, we did a prioritization of targeted people to reach and geographical mapping of the vulnerability by crisis for having the most affected geographical area by crisis, as you see on the map in the online. And so for the last standard allocation of the pooled fund we launched last year, we had a standard allocation based with a cross-cluster and multi-year funding and resilience approach for projects between 18 to 24 months. And first of all, we had a preparation of the launch with a provincial level of coordination. We have like provincial HCT, where the humanitarian actors are involved, especially NGOs and UN, of course. And it was the first step to identify what was the most important crisis by province. We have 11 provinces in the country. And what will be the most important area or axis of intervention. And for example, in North Kivu, in the eastern part of the country, the provincial level of coordination decided to focus the allocation on areas where there are most of the needs according to the HNO, but where there were a lack of factors to fill the gaps. So after the preparation of the launch, we did the launch of the according to the HC and HCT, and we received 121 proposals. That means 165 million of USD, but we had an envelope of 30 million only, so we had to select only 18 projects. So it was a quite tough work to do, and for example, one province couldn't have some funds, but we had to follow our criteria which were validated by the pool fund board, where we have representatives of the NGOs, national NGOs, donors, and UN agencies, and the pool fund unit, of course. And for the full process of selection of projects, we had a bottom-up approach from the provincial level to the capital. And for us, it's very important the provincial level has a good weight and for the standard allocation and for other specific allocation, because it is where we have the alert warning in case of crisis. And for each step, it's very participatory and with involvement of every actors from the provincial level to the capital. And for us in NGOs, it's very important because it guarantees a transparency and an inclusiveness, but of course it creates a long process and sometimes with a complex and evolving crisis, it's quite a problem. But to be more effective or efficient, it's quite hard. Here we should do the prioritization at midterm. We should do midterm review prioritization to see how it is going on and to give more analysis of gaps based on consolidated data, which are a problem here in DRC. Okay, thanks. Back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Liz. What a challenge. Out of 165 million requests, you could only allocate 18 projects out of 121 coming from 11 provinces. I think it's encouraging to hear your bottom-up approach, that you include the provinces, you look across the 4 different types of crisis, and then you bring it all together at the central level, where I guess you would have to prioritize in between also provinces, and between crisis, and between projects. But also I heard you talk about transparency, having the NGOs, the UN, the donors, a fairly open process where everybody buys into that bottom-up approach to be able to finally say, how do we do it? Emily, now the priorities, are these the same as the Humanitarian Response Plan priorities, or do they evolve? How does it go?
No, it just follows, and quite every donors in DRC are following the prioritization of the HNO and the HRP. As I said, for the pool fund and for the CERF, we just follow the HRP because it's, as I said, an inclusive and a participatory process.
Thanks, that's really important. I'd like us to go back to Baghdad, back to Liz. And Liz, I would really like to hear from you a little bit more on the nuts and bolts on how did you go about it? Who made the decision? I mean, you as a humanitarian coordinator, did you involve the ATT, the intercluster, the donors, the NGOs? What were the steps you followed, and what lessons have you learned from this quite rigorous exercise that you undertook in Iraq? Liz, over to you.
Panos, the first step was in February when we took a $2.2 billion strategic response plan and we identified fast-track priorities. And at that stage, the first step in prioritization was to say which life-saving programs are closing, when are they closing, and can an injection of money in the short term help to keep those programs alive? We did that exercise through the cluster system. It took about 2.5 weeks, and we then presented a document of those fast-track priorities to donors. That was the first step. The second step involved completely redoing the strategic response plan, and we took that decision collectively because we realized that the plan itself didn't make a lot of sense. And here I'd like to pick up on an observation that Dylan made when he noted that many donors feel that many appeals are bloated. And Dylan, in the case of the Iraq strategic response plan, that was absolutely the case. It was a bloated document. And rather than keep trying to fast-track priorities out of a document that was itself flawed, we made the collective decision on the country team to redo the strategic plan itself. The process we followed went as follows. The first step was to establish clearly the needs for each cluster. That was a process which we had hoped to do through a standardized assessment process. Instead, what happened was that individual clusters identified the needs stretched across Iraq, including in areas that we couldn't reach, but that we had key informants providing information on that allowed us to guesstimate what was going on. So the first step is establish where the needs are. The second step, and again, that was done by clusters. The second step was to very clearly identify what the international standard of support should be for each cluster. Okay? And we didn't pull back from that. And in fact, we regarded that as part of our moral responsibility. So having identified the needs, we said to each cluster, what is the international standard for your cluster to reach those needs? At that stage, not surprisingly, when you looked at the costing for those international standards across each cluster, not only did we have an appeal the size of the one we were trying to redo, in fact, the size of the appeal had grown enormously. It was unsustainable, and it wasn't credible. And we had a very active donor community which said to us, we're spending a lot of money in other parts of the Middle East. We don't have very much money for Iraq. So going with an appeal based on international standards isn't going to work in the case of your operation. So what we then did was to say to every single cluster, please identify the minimum package of support your cluster wishes to appeal for in support of the international standards. So you establish the standards, that's the bar. Then what you say is, we can't reach those standards. But what we do ask the international community to support is this minimum package. Now, the difference between the standard and the package we're appealing for is an ethical difference. Someone's got to fill that difference. In the case of Iraq, we've had discussions with the authorities in Baghdad and the authorities in the Kurdistan regional government, saying to them, this is what we can do. Here's the minimum package. This is what we're asking for. There's a difference between the standard and that package. And of course, we look to you as the primary responsible party for humanitarian assistance to step in and fill that. We also wanted to be very clear with everybody that in stepping forward with a minimum package, we all explicitly understood that we were backing off of that international standard. If you allow me a small anecdote, when we launched the Humanitarian Response Plan a month ago in Brussels, it was the first point that we made. This is not the appeal we as a humanitarian community wanted to launch. We wanted to launch an appeal on international standards. We did it. We launched an appeal on a minimum package. And again, each package was defined by the clusters themselves. What we then said to the clusters was, now we want you to sequence that package. Show what is the first line response out of the package. Sequence that into the second line response and sequence that further into a full cluster response. And we explicated the activities for each line, the first line activities, the second line activities, and the third line activities. When you look at the Iraq Humanitarian Response Plan, we color-coded them. So you look at the plan for WASH. You see in blue, I believe, the first line response. Then you see followed right after that in a different color, the second line, and then the third line, the full cluster response. So we had a minimum package that was sequenced. We also said to the clusters, cost each line. So we can tell you roughly for WASH what a first line response will cost. We can tell you roughly what a second line response in WASH will cost, and we can tell you roughly what a full cluster response will cost per capita, per head, or per family. Okay, so that was the process that we went through. Now, we were under considerable pressure, particularly from donors, to confirm across the clusters which responses were more important. In fact, I remember a conversation I had with one of the world's most important humanitarian donors who said, your job is to say whether water is more important or whether food is more important. And I hope you will allow us to be frank, our humanitarian country team would not do that. We felt that that was a morally unacceptable position to put us in. So we identified the needs. We stood strong on what the international standards were. We were honest about the minimum package and the ethical gap between the two. We took those minimum packages for every cluster and we sequenced them and we put a dollar amount per capita or per family for each of the sequencing. What we would not do, what, if I may say, our conscience would not allow us to do, was to say that one aspect of a critical life-saving activity is more important than another. Okay, for us, everything that was a first-line response was critical. And against those first-line responses, we were not going to say one was more important than another. That's how, when the country team grappled with these issues, that's how we ended up coming out on that very difficult, very sensitive question. In all of our advocacy panels on the Humanitarian Response Plan, the point that we make again and again and again about what we did was that ethical gap between the standard. And of course, you know, if you look at the international standards for humanitarian assistance, they are already at the minimum. You know, they are our collective global definition of a dignified standard. Right? And we've backed off of those. I mean, we did so with trepidation. We knew that in backing off of those standards, that we were opening a conversation with profound implications. We did so under duress. Over to you.
Thanks, Liz. It's really interesting to follow the process that you took with the first step, the second step, your acknowledgement that the SRP was perhaps bigger, bloated, as you said, bigger than what it should. So really, what you're talking about credibility. but also this really very, very difficult exercise on putting together what you described as the ethical dilemma, the ethical difference in between the what should really be the standards, which is at the point on really what are the things that we should be giving and responding to, and then the minimum package on what needs to go in, but also the sequencing of this package into a first line, second line, third line of the response, and even color coding them. I have to say, looking at the Iraq humanitarian response, and I'd like everybody to encourage you to look at it, it's available online. What is clear is to be able to see what the gap is, what you can do, but also what you're not able to do, and to see this by sector, by cluster, and so on. That's really quite helpful, and in the advocacy, I'm sure the donors and everybody must appreciate the way to go about it. I'd like actually to move back to Dylan. And Dylan, a minute ago, Emily talked about the pool fund. So I wanted to hear a little bit from you, your take on the pool fund, which is a de facto way of empowering a humanitarian coordinator and a team on the ground to take a decision. But also, I'm looking at my watch, and it's also 45 minutes past the hour, and I really want to thank all of you who have sent questions, and really encourage those who have not to keep on sending us questions, which from this point on I'm going to be taking to the field. And Dylan, there is also a question that just came up for you, saying that basically the accepted definition of disasters refers to natural or man-made hazards or disasters. Should the humanitarian response plan include issues such as chronic diseases, regular food gaps? Are these to be considered hazards? Should they be taken out from a more development or a different funding approach? So, Dylan, over to you.
Great, thanks, Panos. I'm going to come to that question, and the question you asked about CHFs, but I just wanted to talk to respond to Lee's point about the kind of life-saving nature and the work that she's done. And I think she's absolutely right when she pushes back on the donor that said, "Can you do either or?" So I hope that wasn't us, but anyway. But I also wanted to just mention protection, because I think that's an important area that people often don't view as life-saving, and I think it's the whole of system approach to protection review just talked about. You know, we do need to be considering protection right up there with some of the other things. Anyway, I'll park that. So coming on to the sort of pooled funds, I think our overview is that pooled funds are really effective in practice, and we're very keen to build on the advantages they offer rather than to change the model. And as you noted, I think this is certainly something that we see as really important around empowering the humanitarian coordinator, the clusters and coordination, allowing for flexibility, giving the HC freedom to channel funds to different priorities. But also it has a significant influencing and multiplier effect. And I do think it allows donors, for example, with no country presence to put funds in, and it enables smaller funding passes, which sometimes the donors can't necessarily do given our own kind of admin and management constraints. In terms of some of the things I think we should be doing on pooled funds and encouraging, I was part of the ODSG visit to the Syria region earlier this year, and we saw fantastic work in Gaziantep, where they really have focused on getting local NGOs engaged within the pooled fund system, building their capacity to respond, ensuring that there's a pre-qualified process so that if the needs change, there's a flexibility very quickly to fund those NGOs and to fund them differently. And I think flexibility, agility of pooled funds is really important. I do think there's still some problems with some of the sort of funding that is managed maybe by New York end, where we do see sort of very dispersing time. So, for example, again, on that same visit, I think we're in, it was Lebanon, where winterization was just happening as a result of delayed payments from New York rather than decision making. So I think there are some issues in terms of the management of them, but generally we think they are very important. I think increasingly we probably need to move more towards sort of multi-year financing, particularly in protracted crises. And I think it'd be good to look at how pooled funds can rise to that challenge. And we certainly see as donors efficiency savings through more multi-year approaches. I think also we've seen pooled funds being quite responsive to the needs of women and girls. And again, I want to sort of cite the Iraq model here, where having gender as part of the pooled funds from the beginning was really important. So I think there's a lot we can learn. On the broader question about SRPs and what should they or shouldn't they include, I think this is really a judgment for the humanitarian country team. We believe that donors need to be part of those teams, which of course is I think then empowers us to sort of buy into decisions that the HCTs are making. So I wouldn't like to say it's in or out, but I do think when we start to talk about things like provision of education, basic service delivery, those things can probably be better funded by the development budget through sort of long-term approaches. So I think that's hopefully answered the question.
Thanks, Dylan. This is very helpful. I'm actually going to move back to Liz with another question we got. Actually, two questions we got from the field, from two locations, Sudan and another location, which are both along the same line. And this is really about defining what is life-saving when you do your first tier or second tier, when you look through the criteria that you described, Liz. So the caller is asking you, what do you include in this life-saving criteria? How about considering other needs that are important, but perhaps not the most urgent, but then if you overlook for a long time, they could also become urgent. How do you decide what to include in your first and second tier, and is life-saving the only criteria to go about it? Liz, over to you.
That's a really important set of questions. And what happened in the case of Iraq was that the definition of the sequencing, the things that were rolled out first, the things that were rolled out as the second line response, and the things that were rolled out as the full cluster response were decided by the clusters themselves, and they were not necessarily based on life-saving criteria. We said to the clusters, you define the minimum package and you sequence that. If you as a cluster feel that an activity should be a first line response that is not life-saving, and you can defend that, you can justify that in front of the cluster board, we will support you. After each cluster came up with their minimum package and their sequencing, they came in front of a peer group. It included 2 NGOs, 2 donor representatives, 2 UN agencies, and an ex officio member. And each cluster, in some cases it was just the cluster coordinators, in other cases they brought all the cluster partners together. We didn't legislate that. We said, you as a cluster come and defend your approach. And in many cases, more than half of all of the clusters, as their first line response, included activities that would not fit a narrow definition of life-saving. And again, what we did is we said to the clusters, we trust you. You know what your minimum package is. You've defined it. You will be the drivers of the sequencing. Make sure that it's a logical process based on evidence that you can defend in front of a group of peers. I will say that in the first round of defenses, there was a big struggle with that. But as the clusters grew in confidence when they came back for their second round of defenses, many of them took activities which they had self-censored out because they weren't life-saving from first and second line and inserted them in. And if they could make the case for that, the board absolutely supported them. So we got ourselves out of the cul-de-sac of life-saving, because it really is a cul-de-sac. What we said to clusters is you sequence activities as you see fit. And as I said, more than half of them, if you actually look at the Iraq appeal and you look, in fact, the first line response is not done in blue, it's color-coded pink. And the second line response for each cluster is in orange, and the third full cluster responses in blue. You can see across the clusters that many first and second line responses include all kinds of activities which are of a critical nature, not necessarily of a life-saving one. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Liz. This is really, I would say, the most important question of this whole discussion on how do you set the boundaries, what is inside, do you just go life-saving? And Liz, what I heard you talk is about common sense or what makes sense on that particular situation, and you're using an approach which is really kind of more contextualized and broader. It's not just the life-saving. You're talking about first tier, second tier, and so you define that as you go in terms of what makes sense in that particular context to include. Andy, I'm going to come now to you, actually on the same topic. I really want to hear your views on that. And also there is a caller who sent us a question to say, also, how do we do this prioritization, also defining what is in between classes as well? Because while we can do it within, what is really difficult is one cluster telling the other, you know, we do this, more of this or more of that. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Panos. Yeah, I really wanted to pick up on what Liz was saying, because I agree this is a super important question, and I think she's made some really good points on this, and there's some really good practice in Iraq on how they handled it. I think you know, that even if activities aren't determined to be in that front line, or potentially even in the second line if there are more than two categories. And this is why I think prioritization has tended to get a dirty word, or become a dirty word, is that we often then think, okay, anything that's not in that first and second line, those aren't going to get funding, and they're going to be kind of brushed to the side. And I think it's important that if we are true to our strategic planning process, we're true to the objectives that we've set out in our plan, to the outcomes we're working to achieve, we mustn't lose sight of those activities that maybe aren't in the first tier, because they are, as we've defined in our plan, critical to achieving the overall objectives. So while at the same time we may be saying, you know, we need X amount of money for this first tier set of activities, we should be continuing to identify the resources that are necessary to fund that second tier. Those aren't being pushed out or determined to be unnecessary as a result of that prioritization. So it's important that we talk that way when we talk about the actual prioritization. And I think Liz has given a really good example of where there was objectivity, transparency, which led to really good buy-in around the prioritization that was ultimately agreed with. When it comes to kind of cross-cluster prioritization, I mean, more and more we are seeing humanitarian response plans that don't have just sector-specific objectives, but have strategic objectives that obviously cut across a number of clusters. And if you're going to achieve those objectives, you certainly need interventions from a number of different clusters to achieve those. So the notion that you can prioritize one sector over another just makes no sense whatsoever. You have to look back at what are the objectives you're trying to achieve, what are the interventions, activities needed to achieve those objectives, and then prioritize within those, which means if one of your objectives is related to reducing malnutrition and you've got sky-high GAM rates in a given area, you're not just going to need some nutritional feeding centers. You're going to need health actors intervening. You're going to need your nutrition actors, your water actors, etc. So it's really about you know, looking at what did we say we wanted to achieve, and what are the different activities across the sectors that need to be put in place to achieve those objectives. Back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to move to Kinshasa and bring Emily Emily, you have actually looked and practiced this, the life-saving versus other, looking at livelihoods, looking at resilience, looking at other needs. Can you tell us your DRC experience on how did you go about doing this exercise in a protracted crisis that has been there for many, many years? Emily, over to you.
Yes, in DRC, as I said before, there are huge needs for life-saving activities in terms of protection, malnutrition, health, etc., for the most vulnerable. But for many NGOs and donors, we found that we really need to add some resilience activities too in our HRP for fighting the roots, for absorbing shocks, for the population, for absorbing shocks, for avoiding the repetition of the crisis, the chronicity of the assistance. Of course, life-saving is at the first, and our resilience activities should not hamper the answer based on needs. But in DRC, our resilience is one of the transversal theme of the HRP. And for example, for a crisis of malnutrition, as Andrew said before, we have some activities of course, for giving food to malnourished infants, but we have too some activities for strengthen the capacity of vulnerable families, some food security activities for crop, to avoid the repetition of malnutrition. And for us, it's very important, and it was a push from NGOs to have in DRC multi-year funding with life-saving and a resilience approach. And for example, through the pool fund, as I explained before, the standard allocation, we put an emphasis on the resilience approach with actions of prevention, preparedness, but also in terms of exit strategy to promote autonomy and sustainable solutions. And because we are in protracted crisis, we want to exit from it, and we need to go with resilience approach. Even if life saving is important, we need to do the bridge. And for us, it's very important to have cross clusters approach, to consider the problem in a holistic manner, and for the vulnerable to have a more complete package and not separate needs. Back to you.
Thanks, Emily. I'm actually going to move back to Iraq, back to Liz. Liz, there is a colleague who is listening to you in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and they're saying a question saying that I'm sure you can also relate to it, saying that we're in a context where the humanitarian needs are there, they're growing, they're increasing. You spoke about the minimum package versus the international standard. You spoke about this ethical difference, this ethical gap. So let's say we go ahead and we identify the first tier. At the same time, we know that the government is enabled to fill this gap. It is enabled really to add to what we're already doing. So how can we really be responsible? How can we do this in a responsible way? How do we go about it, knowing that this would leave a huge ethical dilemma as we proceed with the different tiers that nobody else is willing or available to fill? Liz, over to you.
I think that this is really as Graham Greene would say, the heart of the matter. And this is why in the case of Iraq, the country team was absolutely determined not to sidestep that question. And that's why we were so explicit about what the standards were, what the package was, and what the difference in between is. Because, of course, the difference in between then becomes the basis for humanitarian advocacy. That's what you advocate for, is the filling of the gap between what we will try to do with the resources received, what the international community has all agreed is the standard for dignified existence. Now, in the case of Iraq, we're in a situation where with a middle-income country, our advocacy could be aimed at our counterparts in the government to fill the gap because they had the resources to do that. If you're talking about working in a country where the government doesn't have the financial resources to do it, your advocacy is then aimed at the partners that do, whether that's your traditional donors, whether that's new donors, whether that's members of the expanded humanitarian community, religious endowments, philanthropists, whether it's the private sector. You know, this is context specific for countries where you have governments that are fiscally strapped. In countries where governments are politically indifferent, then the advocacy agenda is about changing that indifference to social commitment and to a social compact. And again, it will vary country by country based upon what the specific nature of the environment is and how you as a country team address that. In the case of Iraq, I think the fact that we were so explicit about the gap, the ethical gap between the standard and the package, has sharpened our advocacy and made it much more, number one, pointed, and number two, what would be the word here, committed in our interactions with the government. We literally say to the government, you know, here is the difference. Can you fill that in your next budget? Can we help you with your next budget so that it does get filled? Before, we would say to the government, you need to do more. Now, we say to the government, here's the difference. Here's the gap that needs to be fit. And that's a very different, much more focused, much sharper conversation in advocacy terms than the one we were having before. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Liz. Dylan, I'm going to come your way. And one of the callers is sending a question to say, you know what, it is really, really complicated. It's not just what us humanitarian actors look at the priorities. It's not just what donors sometimes look at the priorities. It's also the host government. The national authorities always, often, have their own priorities. And also which priorities might not be in line with the humanitarian standards or with the neutrality, independence, and lens that we have there. As a donor, as a government, what influence can you have on this, and how do you look at this, at all these conflicting priorities at the operational level? Over to you.
Thanks for the question. I mean, it is really complicated, and I don't think there's a straight answer to this. It's very context specific. Obviously, we believe in a natural disaster situation, if a government is not party to a conflict, that the government should lead, and the government is there to, you know, elected by the communities it serves. So I think very much that we should be working alongside governments like the government of the Philippines in those big rapid onset natural disasters. However, I do think particularly in conflict-affected crises, we need to obviously have a much more neutral approach, and therefore, you know, that's why we have humanitarian coordinators and other more neutral organisations who will be setting these agendas, who understand humanitarian principles and who aren't party to a particular conflict. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. I do think that we have a role to play as donors in supporting those governments that are able to lead a response, to build their capacity to do so. And I do think at the moment that sometimes to take Haiti as an example, sometimes the international system surges in and doesn't listen to the government and doesn't replace it, and then leaves again and leaves the government with a bit of a mess. So I think actually we need to be much better as donors at providing support to governments, probably through development financing in advance of disasters, preparedness capacity building, so that they can support and can lead responses. But of course that's not the case where you have conflict.
Thanks, Dylan. We have received multiple questions on the same topic, which is related to prioritization and engagement of the affected communities. And the question is really, how do we involve the affected people in the prioritization? How do we make sure that when we look at the priorities, these are the priorities that really the communities have also see for themselves? And I think this is a question that almost all of you, I'm sure more than one, can provide the feedback on looking at it. I'm going to start with Andy here in Geneva, and then I'd like to also hear other views, perhaps go to Emily and also hear afterwards. So Andy, AAP and prioritization.
Thanks, Panos. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question, and we know it's a question that a lot of colleagues in the field are struggling with. I think as a collective, we are getting better about ensuring we're being more accountable to affected people through the program cycle. We're being more accountable when we're doing a much better analysis of needs that's based on the practice of participatory needs assessment. So we're getting those opinions, the ideas of affected people in during that needs assessment period, and working that into the analysis of needs that helps us to determine which are the needs that we're going to respond to. Obviously, during the planning process also, we're taking that into consideration, what we know about not only what the needs are, but what affected people have told us are the best way to respond to those needs, which may be different from one group to another within a country. So it's that element of making sure we've listened not only to what the need is, but what they say about how it needs to be met. Prioritization, then, of course, as we've said, is about that sequencing. What needs to happen first, and that's really, I think, an operational programming element that we need to take responsibility for, based on the analysis of needs, what we know about access, perhaps other considerations, etc. The key for me is, when we do prioritize, is that we need to be transparent about it. People, not only within our community, but beyond, and affected people need to understand why we may be doing certain things in certain areas first, and holding off on doing certain things later. That communication is so critical, and it's a part of involving them in the response. If they know, if they at least have the knowledge of why something isn't happening immediately, to me, that's about showing our respect to them as affected people who we're serving. The other key area where this comes in is of course in monitoring, and as we're getting better and better about that collective response monitoring, and making sure that we're building into the response monitoring feedback mechanisms from affected people, that's where we really start to see, in fact, where was our prioritization correct? Did we get to the people we needed to on time? And that will either validate the prioritization that we did, or perhaps lead us to adjust prioritization going forward, which is obviously something we do advocate. Prioritization isn't something that happens just once during your implementation period, but happens when it needs to happen. And that monitoring that you're doing may spark you to review the prioritization and adjust it. Back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Andy. Emily, can you tell us in 2 words, how did you make sure that the priorities of the people, the affected people, were the same with what you agreed as the priorities in the DRC context? How did you bring the voice of the people on the table when making these very, very difficult decisions?
Yes, in fact, it's not really in the Humanitarian Action Plan or in the pool fund, where we have more prioritization in terms of geographical areas or number of estimated people to reach. But we really take into account the individual prioritization, at the project level, in the program level. As Andrew said, with needs assessment, of course, at the beginning, here it is where we define with affected people on their priorities in terms of needs, which sector and what are their specific needs, and how we will target beneficiaries. And Andrew said before, communication is really important, and implication of beneficiary is essential for the success of the action. And I say, every NGOs, for example, are conscious of this. And in DRC, quite every cluster includes some activities of protection mainstreaming, including how to include beneficiary, how to involve them, and how to make some mechanisms of feedbacks and complaints, for example, with focal point in the community or with free numbers to give to beneficiaries to complain. So we have different ways, and in each cluster we try to focus on this, and the protection mainstreaming is really important for us for the accountability to affected people.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to move to Liz, and Liz, we got a question from Yemen. One of the callers is actually asking about the gender approach in prioritization, which is, of course, is part of the broader protection approach. Protection, operationalizing protection, but also looking in particular at the needs of women and girls in them. And the question is, of course, we all agree this is important and we have to put it in. However, sometimes we hear within the community the argument that, well, the resources are too limited, or the government will not agree because this is not culturally or traditionally a priority within the region, and therefore let's drop it. How do you go about it when you look at the priorities according to first tier, second tier, to make sure that the protection, in particular the needs of women and girls, are included? Over to you, Liz.
In the case of Iraq, we aggressively, proactively use the gender marker during all stages of the process, not only in the needs assessment as the first step, but also in the way that the minimum packages were designed against the international standards. So at every stage in prioritization, the gender marker was used to, as Andy said earlier, set the boundaries for the discussion. Our experience previous to that had been that the gender marker was a very useful tool, but it was one that often came in at the end of the process. It was something that was used when you were trying to rate or code individual projects, and we realized that we needed to do much more with it, which is why we used it, we front-loaded it in the strategic part of the prioritization exercise. We also, as part of our advocacy work with our counterparts in the government, spent a lot of time discussing, when we were doing assessments, when we were doing the international standards, when we were doing the minimum packages, why these particular set of questions were so central to everything that we were trying to achieve, and seeking the guidance and the agreement with our counterparts that those issues remain at the center of what we were doing. But the short answer to this very important question, as I said earlier, was to use the gender marker strategically rather than as simply a ranking mechanism for projects, which had been a mistake that we had made previously. Back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Liz. A very, very important message on this one, indeed, on using the gender marker strategically in the response. And we also saw in Iraq how protection really was one of the lenses that you look throughout the prioritization exercise that was there in place. I'm going actually to move over into Dylan, and we have about 10 minutes left and so many questions that are coming in. I'm really encouraged with the active engagement, and obviously the answers trigger more and more questions. Dylan, one of the callers in saying that when we look at the Humanitarian Response Plan and when we look at the funding through the financial tracking system, we realize that actually increasingly more and more donors are funding outside the Strategic Response Plan. You have an operation that has put sincerely a plan in place. They have prioritized this plan. They have gone through a difficult exercise to decide what's first tier or what is their activity that they would like to do first, and yet we see funding coming outside this process. Why is this happening? And shouldn't there be also some carrot, some encouragement, at least for the operations who do go through the exercise, who do come up to at least have a recognition, and then all the donors within the good humanitarian donorship spirit to really give the funding and give basically the vote of confidence that to the field who have gone through this exercise. Dylan, over to you.
Great, thanks, and it's a really good question. And I think absolutely we should be funding through the SRP, and you know that's certainly what we believe. We always look to the SRP first. However, there are exceptions. I think from our perspective, often in rapid onset natural disasters, if I take the Philippines or Nepal recently, we had to make decisions within the first 3 days of that emergency hitting. You know, that's what our ministers want. So I'm afraid the SRPs came too late for that. So you know, there is an issue about timeliness, particularly in those disasters, and it's the same for most donors. We're under intense political pressure to make very quick decisions when it hits the media. So I think that needs to be looked at perhaps by OCHA as something. I also think, you know, in some circumstances, donors will already have been funding programs. So I think that we should be looking more at how do we align some of our programs with the SRP. So for example, again in Nepal, we aligned a lot of our big development programs with the response and the need. So for example, we had a big social protection program, we had a violence against women and girls program that we then shifted to look at how that could be supporting the SRP. And I think also if you look at somewhere like Lebanon, where Ross Mountain in the Lebanese crisis response plan has taken a broader view on the crisis plan and has looked at some of the development activities as well. And I think that's really important in terms of coordinating in these sort of longer term protracted crises. So I think ideally, yes, we want to just fund through the SRP, but in practice, there are some circumstances where we're not necessarily immediately able to do that. And I think OCHA probably needs to look at what those are and how can we do better. I also, very quickly, while I've got the mic, just wanted to say on the AAP issue, I think there is a lot more we can do. We struggle with this in DFID, but cash offers us a lot of opportunity to really help to meet need much more locally. I think we can use better innovative technology, social media. In Nepal, we've got a system-wide response now looking at AAP, which I think is really interesting in terms of how we can take it to scale. But certainly, absolutely, AAP is something that was really critical for DFID and something we also find challenging. Thanks.
Thanks, Dylan. Indeed, the use of cash is really an emerging one. And one of the future webinars, we actually have a two-part series coming out at the end of the summer on the cash, which is really extremely important. I'm actually going to, we're running out of time. There's only 5 minutes left. I want to point out to all the listeners that you will see on your screen in front of you the polling questionnaire. And as we're talking, I'd like to encourage you to give us feedback on how you found the webinar through the multi-answer questions as we go through. Andy, I'd like to come to you with a question that we also got from a caller, putting it very bluntly about this whole question on prioritization of mandate versus operational priorities. And you talked about boundaries and you talked about how to go about it. I would also, in the same answer, if you could also tell us very briefly on really, you've looked at so many models from a headquarters point of view. For colleagues who are listening, what is the ideal model for prioritization? What would it look like? What is the criteria? And if you can incorporate also the mandate part into it, that would be great.
Thanks, Panos. Yes, I mean, we do hear a lot of talk about mandates and how, and concerns in the way in which that unduly influences the strategic planning or prioritization processes. And I think that was one of the key changes that the ERC and the ISC principles were trying to push as part of the transformative agenda. Not that we question mandates or we undo mandates, but how, with respect to each other's mandates, how can we be more strategic, more accountable, work more together as a collective to achieve a set of common outcomes. And I think little by little that is happening, and that's why you're seeing, you know, as Dylan has pointed out, in a number of countries, much higher quality of needs analysis and strategic plans being reflected in the humanitarian response plan. So we're gradually getting there, but it does require some behavior change across the system. So when it comes to what is the ideal prioritization exercise or process looks like, I come back to what I was saying in the beginning, and that it has to start with that solid needs-based strategic plan that sets out the boundaries of your response. What are your strategic objectives? What are you setting out to achieve? And what are the activities you need to put in place to achieve those objectives? That has to be the starting point, and it provides you later then the framework within which to prioritize. So then the next step is, and this needs to happen as part of that planning process, not further somewhere down the road, you need to agree those prioritization criteria. And as we said, those prioritization criteria may change from one context to another. You may use some of the standard ones that we use today around most life-saving, time-critical, or critical enabling. But then you may go down a bit deeper and look at some that are a bit more context-specific, such as do the activities support local partners if part of your one of your strategic objectives or part of one of your strategic objectives is about building resilience. You know, you may place a great deal of emphasis on, if you're in a country where access is problematic and the road infrastructure is terrible, on getting those roads in shape to get goods to people. And then there may be like critically dependent activities, like an activity from one sector that depends critically on the implementation of an activity from another. So it's really, we unfortunately can't give a set list of criteria. It's really a discussion that needs to happen at the country level. But once those criteria are agreed, they may be applied either to activities and stop there. So you would say, you know, the distribution of agricultural kits is a priority in a severely food insecure area, and you may just stop there. Some countries have taken it a step further and then prioritized projects. So using the same criteria, identifying projects that are in alignment with the activity priorities that were set, and therefore the rest of the plan. So it's really up to what makes the most sense in a given country. That project level may be useful if you need to do a blitz of donors to get some very specific projects funded. But it's really decision making that needs to take place there. And then the fourth and final element is the notion that this isn't just a one-off exercise. It should be a dynamic exercise that takes place throughout the period of the implementation of your plan as you need it, whether it's because there maybe have been an escalation of the crisis and therefore you need to review the criteria, or your monitoring data shows you that elements of the response that weren't prioritized are actually, the fact that they aren't yet being implemented is having a negative impact on others. So it's really about looking at it from time to time, making sure the criteria are valid, making sure that they are being applied correctly. And I see there was a question that came up on the chat about some of the guidance and tools for that. We've done a handout in advance of the webinar, and we can, of course, expand upon that. It sounds like it may be necessary. Back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Andy. I'd like to point out that you can see in front of you on the screen, actually, the email address of Ignacio Leon, who works with Andy. If you have questions on prioritization, if you really would like to come back to Ignacio and get some specific advice for your own context, for your own operation, you can see his email there, leoni@un.org, and his telephone line, where he would be very happy to see how to best support you, to provide guidance or whatever is needed to bring it to life. I'm going actually to go very briefly to the field to give the last voice to both Emily and to Liz. And Liz, the question is that we have from the field, and this is really the last question, is about the importance of the information. One of the callers says, we do want to do the prioritization. The information is really not adequate, is not enough to help us make the right decision. How do we go about making a decision where we don't have very accurate data? If you could give us in 2 words your thinking, Liz.
This is precisely the situation that we found ourselves in when we started our own prioritization exercise. We did not have a standardized assessment methodology that allowed us to, in detail, know the needs across sectors, across clusters. So we were faced with a situation where we were trying to make judgment calls about what was needed when we didn't have the evidence base to do that with confidence. We've just had the operational peer review team that's come out to Iraq to evaluate our work as a level 3 emergency, of course, led by Panos. And this was one of the biggest gaps that the OPR team identified. They said, you've got to get your evidence base in better shape. That being the case, we nonetheless, recognizing that as a weakness in our operation, use the information we did have in the best way possible. Recognizing that we had to take urgent steps in order to improve the assessment process so that we all, the government, ourselves, donors, frontline NGOs, and so forth, had a stronger sense of confidence in the decisions that we were taking. So we were pragmatic because we had to be, knowing that this was a part of our operation that required strengthening.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to move to Emily. And Emily, one of the callers, one of the listeners, has sent a question to say, in view of so many needs, what do you do? We've had this dilemma. Do we give a little bit more to a limited number of people, or do we go with giving too little to a wider number of people? It's really kind of, when looking at the prioritization, we're not sure how to go about it. But even when we decide to do the prioritization, the needs actually keep on evolving. When in situations where the population movement happens quite frequently, how do we manage this constantly reprioritizing when what we have is not enough to go with to start with? So, Emily, over to you.
Yes, in fact, no, we can't say we will give a liter for a more number of people. For us here, we try to reduce the number of targeted people to offer a good answer, and we did it with the geographical mapping, as I said before, and then through the targeting of people to reach the most vulnerable people, and not in terms of status and not in terms of but in terms of vulnerability, and not in terms of sectors, but in terms of the whole answer to it. And even if there are more needs, of course, there are lots of needs and more crises coming and everything. We have to focus on the most vulnerable, and that's what we are trying to do here in DRC.
Thanks, Emily. This brings us really to the end of this webinar. I hope you found the conversation, the practical advice, the discussion that took place useful for your operation. We try to be as practical as possible. I would like to point out that all the background documents that were used, including case studies, documents, are included in the website. So if you click to the background documents button in front of your screen, you have access to everything that was presented and papers that were specially prepared to help you guide through the prioritization in your own operation. I'd like to encourage you to reply to the questionnaire, the polling questions that you see in front of you. I would like to say a particular thank you to our speakers for sharing their wisdom, their advice, their experience. Many thanks to Liz Grande, Emily Fernandez, Dylan Winder, and Andrew Wiley for being with us live this morning. We're actually going to have the same conversation in about 4.5 hours on prioritization. And really a big thank you to all of you. I see over 120 listeners from across the globe who stayed with us throughout this webinar. So really thank you for staying with us. And that brings this webinar to an end. I would like to wish you all a very good day. Goodbye from us.